October 1933. The sky over the mill district was the color of cold iron, flat, grey, and going nowhere. A crowd had gathered on the frost-hard ground outside the Hartwell Manufacturing Plant. The kind of crowd that forms when something is ending. Men in worn overcoats, a few officials with clipboards, salvage dealers who had driven 3 counties to get there, their trucks idling in the side lot, already half-loaded in their minds with the copper pipe and cast iron they expected to haul out before nightfall. The auction had been listed in the county records for 6 weeks. Machinery, boilers, steel framework, electrical fixtures, everything inside the Hartwell plant, once one of the largest textile manufacturing operations in the region, was going to the highest bidder, and most of it was going for scrap. Nobody was surprised. The Depression had swept through the industrial corridor like a slow fire, and Hartwell had been one of its casualties. The plant had officially closed in 1931. 2 years of darkness, 2 years of locked gates and silence, and now the bones of the place were being sold off. The demolition crew was the first inside that morning. A foreman named Calvin Marsh led the team, tasked with marking which machinery could be moved intact and which would need to be cut down for transport. They worked fast. There was money on the clock, and the auctioneer wanted the main floor accessible by noon. It was in the northwest corner of the main production floor, beneath the base of a decommissioned spinning frame, that Calvin Marsh first noticed it. The concrete felt wrong. He had been in enough factory floors to know the sound of solid ground beneath a boot. That flat, dense thud of poured slab. What he heard instead was something hollow, something beneath. He called over 2 of his men. They pulled the machinery aside, and there, set flush into the factory floor, so cleanly fitted it was nearly invisible unless you were looking for it, was a steel hatch, heavy gauge, bolted from above. With a locking bar that had been sealed shut with a padlock nobody on the demolition crew had the key for. The auctioneer was summoned. The county official standing nearby took one look at it and said he had never seen it on any inspection record. The building's original blueprints, pulled from the county records office and spread on a folding table outside, showed nothing beneath the northwest corner. Nothing at all. If the factory had truly shut down years earlier, why had someone sealed something beneath the floor? To understand what lay beneath, you first had to understand what Hartwell was, and what it had meant. The Hartwell Manufacturing Company was founded in 1899 by Edwin Hartwell, a Massachusetts industrialist who had made his first fortune in wool processing and saw opportunity in the expanding mill towns of the rural Midwest. He purchased a long parcel of land along a rail line and broke ground on a facility that, when completed in 1903, employed over 400 workers. It was a company town in all but name. Hartwell built worker housing on 3 adjacent streets. There was a company store, a small infirmary, a school that ran to 8th grade. The immigrant families who came to work the looms, Polish, Czech, Italian, a handful of Hungarian, settled in and stayed. The factory became the axis around which an entire community revolved. For nearly 3 decades, the Hartwell plant ran without interruption. It expanded twice, first in 1911 and again in 1921. By the late 1920s, it was producing industrial textile goods under federal supply contracts, canvas sheeting, insulation batting, reinforced cloth used in military applications. Then the market collapsed. The crash of 1929 dismantled the industrial Midwest piecemeal. Hartwell held on for 2 years, longer than many of its competitors, before Edwin Hartwell's son, Robert, announced a full shutdown in the spring of 1931. The gates closed. The 400 workers were let go with 2 weeks of severance. The company town began to hollow out. The plant sat dark for nearly 2 years. That was not unusual. Closed factories across the country were sitting idle, waiting for conditions that never came. But workers who had lived in the company streets, who walked past the plant every day, later said they had occasionally seen lights inside. Not often, not consistently, just enough that it lodged in memory. A truck after midnight, a side entrance that seemed less rusted than it should have been. Small things, the kind of things you file away and never speak about because there is nothing clear enough to say. Several workers later said parts of the factory continued operating after the shutdown. The padlock on the hatch was cut at 9:30 in the morning. Calvin Marsh went down first. He had a lantern. The electrical connection to the factory had been severed when the auction was announced, and the light cast a narrow yellow cone as he descended a steel staircase that dropped approximately 14 feet below the factory floor. What he found at the bottom was not a utility crawl space. It was not a boiler access tunnel. It was not anything that a factory of this size normally contained. It was a working level. The room at the base of the stairs was large. Later measurements would put it at roughly 60 feet by 40 feet, with a ceiling height of 9 feet. The walls were poured concrete, heavily reinforced and bone dry. The floor was finished concrete with drainage channels. Along the far wall were 3 industrial generators, each connected to a buried electrical conduit that ran, according to the later survey, to a junction box located beneath the foundation of a building 2 lots to the east, completely separate from the main factory's power supply. There was ventilation, a series of cast iron pipes that ran vertically through the factory walls, terminating in louvers disguised as standard exhaust vents on the building's exterior. The ventilation system was mechanical, driven by a small auxiliary motor mounted near the generators. The whole system was designed, clearly, deliberately designed, to sustain human occupation and industrial activity without any visible trace above ground. Off the main room were 2 smaller chambers. One appeared to have functioned as an office. A desk bolted to the wall, a row of steel filing cabinets, most of them empty, a corkboard with a few rusted pins still embedded in it. The other was a storage room lined with heavy steel shelving. The shelving was not empty. There were other details that would take days and weeks to fully inventory. A second steel staircase at the far end of the main chamber, leading to a sealed tunnel that extended roughly 30 feet before terminating at a bricked wall. Whether an original dead end or a later addition, nobody could immediately determine. Along one wall, a row of workbenches with vice mounts still bolted in place, the metal worn smooth from use. Overhead, a grid of electrical conduit that had been routed with precision and care, the work of a qualified electrician who had been paid to do the job properly. This was not a temporary hiding place. It was not a cache or a vault. It was a facility, a purpose-built, professionally constructed, deliberately hidden industrial facility dug beneath a factory that the public had been told was dead. Marsh stood in the storage room for a long moment, his lantern moving across the contents. He called up to the county official waiting above. "You need to come down here," he said. And then they found crates stamped with dates years after the factory supposedly shut down. There were 11 crates in the storage room, and not a single one of them should have existed. They were industrial shipping crates, heavy pine, banded with iron strapping, stenciled on their sides with codes and destination designations. Most were sealed. 2 had been opened and reclosed, their lids nailed back down at angles that suggested the contents had been accessed multiple times. What made the crates significant was not their contents. Those would take days to properly examine, but their markings, in particular their dates. The stamps on the crate exteriors showed receipt and inventory dates ranging from 1932 through late 1933. The Hartwell plant had officially closed in the spring of 1931. Whatever had arrived in these crates had arrived after the factory was supposed to be dead, after the gates were locked, after the workers were sent home. The inventory manifests, paper-clipped to the inside lid of the opened crates, were coded in a shorthand that required days of cross-referencing to partially decode. But even the surface information was revealing. References to alloy specifications, to temperature tolerances, to production runs measured in units that did not correspond to textile manufacturing. One manifest listed components described only as refined ingots Series 7C. Another referenced experimental substrate samples. A third bore a header that had been partially obscured with black ink, deliberately it appeared. But where the ink had flaked away at one corner, researchers later identified what appeared to be a federal procurement code. The county official who had accompanied Marsh below ground walked out of the storage room and spent a long time standing in the main chamber saying nothing. The auctioneer, when informed, halted the proceedings and called for a county sheriff's deputy to come secure the entrance. The demolition schedule was suspended indefinitely. The salvage dealers who had come to bid on scrap metal drove their trucks home empty that afternoon. The auction was suspended before the first lot was called. The county official filed a preliminary report that used language, anomalous subterranean infrastructure, that told almost nothing about what had actually been found. It would be weeks before anyone with the appropriate authority came to examine the underground level properly. But the men who had been there that morning, Calvan Marsh and his demolition crew, the auctioneer, the county clerk, the half-dozen salvage dealers who had heard the news and pressed close to the hatch before they were asked to step back, carried the image of those crates with them for the rest of their lives. That was not hidden storage. That was hidden activity. The deeper they searched, the more it looked like someone had continued operating beneath the factory in complete secrecy. Investigators began pulling the paper trail the following week. What they found, or rather, what they failed to find, was its own kind of evidence. The Hartwell Manufacturing Company's public records were incomplete in ways that did not look accidental. Payroll ledgers for the years 1931 through 1933 were missing entirely from the county filing office. The plant's annual inspection reports, required by the state for any facility of Hartwell's size and classification, showed no entry after March 1931, which was consistent with the official shutdown date. There was no record of any inspector ever going below the main floor. because there was nothing on any map that suggested a lower floor existed. Hidden among the remaining filing cabinets in the underground office, however, was a partial set of employee logs. They covered a period beginning in late 1931 and running through at least mid-1933. The logs listed workers by number, not by name. The pay amounts recorded were in keeping with skilled industrial labor, reasonable wages for the Depression era. But the disbursement method was unusual. The wages had not been paid through the Hartwell Company payroll. They had been disbursed through a separate entity, a holding company registered in a neighboring state, incorporated in 1930, with no public-facing operations and no listed address beyond a law firm's postal box. A shell company, created 1 year before the Hartwell plant officially closed. The electrical records told a similar story. The main factory's municipal power connection had gone dark in 1931, consistent with the shutdown. But a separate underground conduit, the one connected to the generators in the basement level, had been drawing power from a commercial account registered to yet another shell entity. Small amounts, carefully timed, spread across billing cycles in a way that would not have raised immediate suspicion. Investigators only identified it because they knew what they were looking for by the time they reached the utility company's records. Someone had spent considerable effort to make the underground operation invisible, not just unannounced. Invisible. The kind of invisible that required planning, resources, and legal infrastructure put in place well before the factory's public closure. Then researchers found correspondence that explained why the underground level existed at all. The correspondence surfaced in 2 stages, weeks apart. The first piece was found inside the false back panel of a filing cabinet in the underground office, a space just wide enough to hold a thin folder of documents. The folder contained copies of 3 contract agreements, each running to several pages, each bearing the letterhead of a federal procurement agency. The contracts were dated 1930 and 1931, straddling the factory's official shutdown, and they referenced the Hartwell facility specifically, not by company name, but by a facility designation code that investigators eventually matched to a federal infrastructure registry. The contracts were for specialized industrial production, refined alloy processing, specifically the kind of high-tolerance metalwork used in certain classes of machinery that the federal government was quietly beginning to procure in the years following the crash. Defense-adjacent materials, experimental components, the kind of work that a civilian textile factory would not, on its surface, appear qualified to perform. But that Hartwell, with its reinforced construction, its isolated rail access, and its labor pool of skilled immigrant machinists, was in fact well positioned to carry out. The contracts had been structured to survive the factory's public liquidation. Payment flowed through the shell company. The public closure provided legal cover. A factory that was officially bankrupt could not be easily scrutinized for ongoing production. The assets had been sold at auction in name only. The essential infrastructure, hidden below ground, was never part of the auction inventory. The second set of documents came from a records request to a federal archive, processed months after the initial discovery. The response was partial. Several pages had been redacted, and one document had been withheld entirely under a classification that investigators were told had since expired but whose records had not yet been fully transferred to the public domain. What remained was enough. The federal contracts confirmed that Hartwell had continued producing under government arrangement for at least 2 years after the public closure. The workers operating the underground level had been told they were working on a sensitive federal project. They had been paid. They had been instructed not to speak about it. Most of them apparently had complied. Meanwhile, on the streets above, their former colleagues, the 400 men and women who had worked the main floor, had believed the factory was dead, had watched the company town empty out, had struggled through the worst years of the Depression without income, without prospects, without any reason to think the machines they had once operated were still running beneath the ground they walked on every day. But one handwritten memo changed the meaning of the entire factory. The memo was found in the drawer of the bolted desk in the underground office. It was handwritten on Hartwell Company letterhead, dated November 1930, 4 months before the public closure announcement. It was addressed to no one specifically. It read more like a note to file, the kind of internal record that executives sometimes produce when they want documentation of a decision without creating formal correspondence. It was brief. It was written in a clear, practiced hand, and it was devastating. The memo outlined, in plain language, the intention to stage a public liquidation of the Hartwell facility while continuing operations beneath the factory floor under federal contract. It noted that the arrangement had been reviewed by counsel and structured specifically to avoid scrutiny. It referred to the workforce that would be laid off as, and this is a direct transcription of the language used, necessary overhead to be shed for acquisition protections. Not people. Overhead. The memo went on to note that the public liquidation was necessary to prevent competitor access to the facility and to satisfy banking obligations connected to a loan restructuring. The federal contracts, it stated, would provide revenue sufficient to service the remaining debts, while the company held the underlying land and infrastructure in legal dormancy. Public liquidation remains necessary for acquisition protections, the memo read. Underground continuation remains operationally viable and legally insulated. There it was, the entire logic of what had been done to the workers, to the community, to the public record, laid out in the careful, bureaucratic language of a man who had clearly convinced himself that what he was doing was simply business. The 400 men and women turned out in the spring of 1931 had not lost their jobs because the factory failed. The factory had not failed. It had simply moved somewhere they could not follow, somewhere they would never be told about, somewhere that continued to generate revenue for the men who had dismissed them, while those men watched from a distance as a company town collapsed, as families scattered, as children went hungry in a depression winter above a factory that was still, quietly, running. The factory had not failed. It had disappeared. Margaret Szymanski was 26 years old when the Hartwell plant closed. She had worked the loom on the second floor for 4 years, ever since she turned 22, following her father, who had worked in the mill since 1909. She had been there long enough to see the place as something permanent, something that would outlast the hard times. She was wrong. She moved back to her parents' home after the shutdown. Her husband, also a Hartwell worker, found intermittent labor on road crews through a county relief program. They lost the small house they had been renting on the company street within 8 months. By 1933, they had moved twice more. Her story was not unusual. Among the 400 workers dismissed in 1931, the pattern repeated endlessly. Displacement, dispersal, the slow erosion of stability that the company town had, for all its limitations and dependencies, at least provided. The school closed within a year of the factory. The company infirmary shuttered. The stores on the main street, most of them dependent on worker wages, failed one by one. Joseph Wierzbicki had been a machine tender at Hartwell since 1914. He was 53 years old in 1931, too old by the Depression's brutal arithmetic to start over in a new trade, too young to stop needing income. He spent 3 years doing odd labor, splitting wood, digging drainage ditches, painting houses for neighbors who could barely afford the paint. His daughter later told an oral historian that her father stopped talking about Hartwell after the first year. "He didn't want to think about it," she said. "I think it hurt him to think about it." What would it have meant to him to know that the factory he attended for 17 years had not actually closed? That somewhere beneath the floor where he had worked, the machines were still running? That his displacement had been a deliberate calculation, and that the men who had made that calculation had continued to profit from the infrastructure he and his colleagues had built, operated, and maintained over 3 decades? We cannot answer that question for him. He died in 1944, before any of this was known. What makes this history difficult to sit with is not simply that hard times came. Hard times came everywhere in the Depression. What makes it difficult is the knowledge that the hardship was manufactured. The closure was a legal fiction. The poverty that spread through those streets in 1931 and 1932 was, in a very precise sense, a product of a decision made in November 1930 by men who had calculated that the workers were dispensable. Overhead to be shed. The workers believed the factory was dead. They believed that because they were told it was dead. They grieved the loss the way you grieve something that has simply ended, the way you accept a misfortune that nobody intended. There is something worse about learning decades later that the thing you grieved had not ended at all, that it had simply hidden from you and continued on without you, and that your loss had been useful to the people who caused it. That is not misfortune. That is a different thing entirely. And for decades, nobody knew the lower level had ever existed. The Hartwell underground level was sealed again in late 1933, pending investigation, and the main plant was eventually demolished in 1936. The records recovered from the underground office were partially transferred to a county historical archive, where they sat in an uncatalogued box for over 40 years before a graduate student researching Depression-era labor history stumbled across them in 1979. The federal contracts were never publicly acknowledged. The shell companies that had funded the underground operation were dissolved by 1935. Their records either destroyed or absorbed into other entities in ways that proved difficult to trace. The men who had drafted the November 1930 memo were long dead by the time anyone read it carefully enough to understand what it said. The workers, the ones who survived, the ones who remembered, mostly never knew. Margaret Szymanski died in 1971. Her daughter, interviewed by the graduate student in 1980, said her mother had spoken of Hartwell only as a place that had been good and then had ended, the way things ended in those years. She had no reason to believe it had been anything other than what she was told. There is something particular about the way industrial history hides. It hides in plain sight, behind the ordinary vocabulary of failure and collapse. Words like bankruptcy and shutdown and market forces that seem to explain things without explaining them. The building stands empty. The building is demolished. The ground is sold. Other things are built on top. The layers accumulate. The original shape disappears. And the people who lived inside that shape, who built their lives around it, who believed what they were told about why it ended, become, in the official record, simply casualties of impersonal forces, not victims of a specific decision, not people who were lied to, just workers who were caught in the depression, the same as everyone else. That is how the story gets buried, not in one dramatic act of concealment, but through the slow accumulation of silence and time and the ordinary entropy of paper and memory. But sometimes the ground gives something back. Sometimes a demolition crew hears something hollow beneath a boot. Sometimes a sealed hatch survives long enough to be opened. Sometimes the paper in the filing cabinet is still legible, and the handwriting is still clear, and the words are still precise enough that there is no mistaking what they mean. The truth about Hartwell did not survive because anyone protected it. It survived by accident, through the same combination of luck and inattention that allows certain things to persist while everything around them is deliberately erased. A memo left in a drawer, a crate stamped with a date, a graduate student with a box of uncatalogued files. Above ground, the factory had been sold for scrap. Below ground, the machinery kept running long after the workers were told everything was over, and buried beneath concrete and rust and decades of silence. The truth survived anyway. If you found this story interesting, share it, subscribe, and leave a comment.